Willkommen in einem anderen Afrikaans video, or welcome to another exciting video. In this case, it's part 2 of my Napoleon at War series of videos. In this case, an example game. Napoleon at War is a series of board games published by SPI back in the 1970s. This video uses a figure game version of these rules. The scenario being played is Day 1 of the Battle of Nations, or the Battle of Leipzig. This is a rather short game, 5 game turns, but does consist of an awful lot of figures. While not really important for this video, the scenario is from my version 1 set of rules, so it's a very close copy of the original SPI scenario. But the rules that I'm using uses the totally rewritten version 2 rules. At the end of the video, I'll go into a little bit more detail about what the difference is between version 1 and version 2 if people are interested. The playing area I'm using is actually custom made to duplicate the map in the SPI board game. This shows the playing area minus the houses on the built up areas. The view is towards the north with Leipzig in the centre top area. This shows the top-down view of the playing area. I did make some errors on this playing area, neglecting 2 critical bridges on the Austrian player edge, which prevented an Austrian corps from assisting against the main French attack. These bridges were added by the designers in this location as a play balance factor, as historically the Austrians actually had to go to a position off the playing area in order to cross the river to do the assistance. This is probably why I missed them when I created this playing area. My initial test game did not have these bridges, and the result was, to put it mildly, not very good. My investigation of why the game ended in such a strange manner allowed me to find the error. I fixed the error, and after 3 additional playtest games, here is the 4th playtest game, which I'm doing the video, which has no error in this particular area. This shows the playing area in the form of a diagram. In this case, this is the template I used to create the custom playing area. The large built-up area in the centre is Leipzig. North is to the left, south is to the right, and France is in the direction of the bottom edge. The road from Leipzig to the bottom edge is the French escape route and is critical for the French to keep open. It's also pretty easy for them to keep open. During this video I'll be zooming into the actual battle areas, and as a result you may not get a full view of the entire battlefield. So just to show you where the main areas of action occurred, the main area of conflict occurred in the southern portion of the playing area, which is indicated with the yellow box. It is here that Napoleon attempted to destroy the Allied army facing him on day 1. Later during the day, or in the scenario, the main Allied attack develops in the north playing area edge, which is the secondary area of action, which is shown here in yellow. On day 1 it's not very serious, but by day 3 it's the main cause of the French loss. While I've played this scenario using the SPI board game many years ago, I was not prepared for the density of the French main army. On the first day, Napoleon attempted to destroy the Austrian-Russian army in front of him. Well, actually, sorry, it was also Prussians involved as well, before any of the other armies arrived from the north. Not even the entire French army had actually arrived in the critical sector when Napoleon struck, so this is not even the main army. This is a large scenario involving an awful lot of elements. You will notice that these figures are actually Prussian figures. Unfortunately, I lack any French figures, so I had to use Prussians for the French and Austrian-British for the Allied armies, because that's all I possessed. I've deployed the Allied armies, and this provides a view of the start position of the game, which of course includes the entire Allied army facing the main French army. In this, while there are Prussians arriving on the top left of the playing area on day 1, which is not visible here, apart from pinning down some French forces, they were not really that critical in this battle. The main action, as you could guess, is the French attack on day 1. In the scenario, the French needs to demoralise the Austrian, Prussian, Russian army and cause it to withdraw, so Napoleon can deal with the Prussian and Russians and Swedish forces coming down from the north, which is on the right edge of the playing area, or the top here, based on this particular view. This shows the top-down view of the main armies. The Allied army has been facing a smaller French force initially, which is the 2-rank line you see closest to it, when the bulk of the French army arrived behind it, which you can see behind it. The Austrians had made a major error and deployed part of the army on the other side of the river, which almost resulted in their defeat. As you can see here, the Allies are fairly heavily outnumbered. Moving away from the main action, this shows the position behind the French front line. The biggest decision the French have is where to send the forces not yet committed. For the day one scenario, most normally move to the French main attack. If playing the full game, it normally remains on the north edge and prepares a defensive line against the approaching Allied armies. This is one of the issues with the day one scenario. You don't have to worry about day 2 and 3, and as a result, you can launch a slightly crazy attack, which is normally what always occurs. This shows the initial deployment for the day 1 and campaign scenario. This is what I use for my scenarios in version 1, and while reasonably accurate, one issue with trying to convert a board game into figure gaming is in a board game the exact position of all the units are very important. In a figure game, it's a little bit harder to exactly get various elements in particular positions, so on day 1 they can actually move. This is one actual issue with this scenario. I think the designers attempted to do too much on a far too small playing area. As a result, they had to do a lot of fudging. Let's start the game with the game turn 1. The first player is the French player. That means the French player is the first player to move and engage in combat. We will start with the southern edge of the conflict, which is where the main French attack occurred. Later in the video, you will begin to see the Allied attack in the bottom left corner of this playing area develop. This shows the position at the end of the French movement phase on game turn 1. The stacking in this particular case is 4 elements, which means each unit can comprise of up to 4 infantry elements, or 2 cavalry elements. Each unit has a single combat value, which is 4 when there are 4 infantry elements, or if it's a cavalry unit, 2 if it's 2 cavalry elements. The red line represents the Austrian movement zone of control, which is basically where the French units stop as they move forward. Basically, on game turn 1, it's all about mass attack as wildly as possible, because the French need to crack the Allies and they don't have very many game turns to do it. So in some ways it does make for an incredibly dynamic and exciting game, if a bit crowded. Incidentally, I use a stacking of 4 here. I think that's probably an error. There's too many elements here. I probably should have gone to a stacking of 2, which means each element represents 4,000 men instead of 2,000 men. But anyway, players can play around with that as they so desire. If you read the rules, you understand what I just basically said here in terms of stacking and density and scale. In these rules, basically, the phasing player can choose the order of attacks, and what really the phasing player wants to try and do is surround units so they can attack, force them to retreat and eliminate them. So let's start with the French attack in the centre, which is at 2 to 1. French spin of 4, which is a DR, which is a defender to retreat. The Austrian unit has to retreat 1 base width, and of course the French follows behind it. As you can see here, the French has advanced, and you'll notice that one of the edges of the French unit is up against an edge of one of the Allied units. This means that it's in contact with that edge. Now, if it can force the unit to the Allied unit there on its left to retreat, which is where the combat occurs here, and advances after combat, it'll have units on either edge of that Allied unit. That means it's surrounded. If it can force that to retreat, it's eliminated. And that's really the main objective of the game, is to surround and eliminate units. In the next attack, the odds are 1 to 1. A 2 is spun and the advance and the attack is successful. The result is a DR, and the Austrians have to retreat 1 base width. Now we see the Austrian unit surrounded, and the French launch their third attack at an odds of 2 to 1. They spin a 5, which is, oh no, an AR, which is attacker retreats. Unfortunately, in this particular case, the combat has failed, although it probably should have succeeded because it was well and craftily conducted. That is by myself. The French now try a long shot surround. They attack at 1-1, spinning a 6, which is attack or retreat. The French have to retreat. One thing I did miss in this game was that when you spin a 1 or a 6, you can actually get single element losses. This is a way to simulate attrition. I forgot this in this particular case. It doesn't really affect the game that much because the name of the game for the first 5 game turns is eliminating allied elements. It's almost impossible for the French to lose enough elements to make a real difference. But nonetheless, something I had to actually go back and retrospectively look at to determine who actually won the game, which you'll see later in the video. Now, the Austrian could advance after combat after the French retreat, but they wisely decide not to. The final attack is not really that relevant. It's 1-1, it spins a 4, it fails, the French retreat. On the French left flank, they attack the thin Russian line. Because the cavalry unit is within 1 base width of 2 Russian elements, they must attack both. They spin a 2, which is a defender result. Now we go to the next attack. The French infantry attacks the Austrian cavalry at 2-1. They spin a 1, which is a DR and D1. In this particular case, I did remember to inflict casualties. The Austrian unit loses 1 element and retreats 1 base width. The first casualty has been incurred. This shows the final position after the French combat phase. What you'll notice is that it's a real mess, and it's understanding the mess and taking advantage of it, which is where the skill comes into this game system. Now the Allied player moves. There's little that he can do apart from forming a line on the right flank and launching a small counterattack in the centre. The red line shows the Allied movement zone of control, or front line, at this particular point in time. Now the Allies actually have a chance of eliminating a French unit. You'll notice that that French column there has an element which has Allied units on either side. It's basically surrounded. If the Allies can force it to retreat, then it is entirely eliminated. This is one of the dangers of launching a wild attack forward. Anyway, the Allies attack at 2-1, but unfortunately spin a 5, and the attack fails, and the attackers retreat. Okay, the Allies do actually have 1 unit which is surrounded. You can see in the centre with the red dice. They need to try and free it up, so they make their last attack, chance attack to free the unit. They spin a 5 on a 2-1. It's a failure. The Allies lose a unit as it cannot retreat. The Allies have now lost 4 additional elements. Casualties are 5. As we move along the front line, the Allies now launch a 1-in-4 attack. Note, in this game system, attacks are compulsory. They have no choice but to attack. So the cavalry must attack. They spin a 3, and the result is the expected defender retreat. At least it wasn't an elimination. The French decide to advance after combat, and the main reason here is that they want to get fairly close to the Allied unit next to it. Normally, when you're the non-phasing player, you don't normally advance after combat because, of course, you're the next player, which has a phasing movement phase. However, you can decide to advance after combat if it means that you can basically ram yourself into enemy movement zones of control. It's very similar to the original board game, and it's, in this case, what the French have done. Okay, the Allies now attack the French cavalry at a 2-1, they spin a 2, and the French must retreat. So a good victory for the Allies in this particular case. This shows the position at the end of the Allied game turn. The Allies are in trouble on this sector of the battle, particularly in the centre, as you can see. The red line shows the effective front line, which happens to be generally the Austrian movement zone of control line. Meanwhile, on the road to France, which is the French escape route, which the French have to keep open, and really not very much occurs in this particular battle, the Austrians have 4 elements. They advance towards the French, hoping the French are silly enough not to reinforce it and force them back. Nonetheless, it's almost impossible for the French to ignore this. They always send forces here, and the main benefit for the Allies is that it basically forces the French to throw more units or elements into this front, which could otherwise be used to attack the Allies on that critical front. So it does actually have a real purpose for the Allies. Finally, the other main area of combat, the Prussian army advances as rapidly as it can against the French position. as you can see here. Now we begin a game turn 2. The French once again move and engage in combat. The French continue their major attack. There is absolutely no reason for them to dilly-dally, so to speak, and they basically put every possible element they can into the front line to attack. The red line represents the Austrian movement zone of control. To deal with the threat from the west, which is the main French escape route to France, the French had been forced to move additional elements across the river, and they form a line. On the north front, the other main area of conflict, the French have actually positioned themselves into a fairly strong defensive line. It's 3 units, maximum strength of 4 each, and they're all double because they're on built-up areas or in woods. So this is pretty difficult to crack. Starting with the French left flank, the French attack at 2-1 and spin a 5. It's an attacker retreat, a rare failure. Next to this failed attack, the French attack the Allied cavalry at 4-1 and spin a 1. It's a DR. Now actually I forgot to take the casualty at this point, but I did take it later. While the cavalry DR should have been a DR D1 and should have been eliminated, this does actually show what happens when you retreat into friendly troops. Basically, the cavalry element retreats 1 base width back. There is an infantry element in the way. It basically pushes it back and actually forms a unit in the process. The French advance after combat. Of course, the reason why the French advance after combat, you'll notice that it's touching the Allied unit, which is being attacked, on its flank. And you'll notice there's another French unit on the other side. So the French are attempting to surround and eliminate it. The next attack is a 1-1, and they spin a 1, which is a DR. The unit is surrounded, so it's eliminated. 2 more casualties. The Allies are beginning to lose elements. Now the French cavalry does advance after combat. When you're in the phasing situation, it's always good to advance after combat if you're launching an attack, because it forces the enemy to counterattack you. And if you get enough stuff into the front line, often the counterattacks will cause the enemy great distress. Next attack is a 4-1, a 5 is spun, it's a DR, it retreats. Now we'll move to the main attack area. The French attack at 2-1, spin a 1, it's a DR, the Allies must retreat. Now when the Allied unit retreats, one flank has a French unit, so it's got to actually move half a base width away from it. Not so clear here, but that's basically what it should be doing, and moves back. The French have advanced after combat because they want to pin it and cause the Allies some problems. The next attack is a 1-1, they spin a 2, which is a DR. Another good result for the French. The French decide to advance after combat. They're attempting to cause as much problem as possible. Also, by advancing after combat, you'll notice there that they've pinned the Allied unit there against the river. This is an interesting clarification because there is no enemy unit on the other side, but it cannot clear the French zone of control, movement zone of control, so if it's forced to retreat, it would be eliminated. The Allied unit is basically surrounded. Even though there is no French unit on the other side, there's a river there, which means it cannot move the necessary half base width away from all enemy zones of control. The French spin a 5 on a 2-1, but unfortunately it fails and it's an AR. The French retreat. Now I didn't cover this in the Game Turn 1 video section, but the Austrians did launch an attack across some bridges over the river. As you can see here, there are 2 bridges here and there are 2 Austrian units. And they managed to occupy the town, which was a great victory, or at least one of the towns. Now the French are counterattacking at 1-1, they spin a 5 and fail, and it's an AR, they retreat. So the Austrians have actually got a foothold in the towns across the river behind the French position, which is not so good for the French. This shows the final position at the end of the French combat phase. The Allied attack on the French right flank is a problem for the French. The Allied player now moves. The first attack was at 2-1 and was a success. The French must retreat and the Allied unit to the left is no longer surrounded, so they've managed to free up that, which is good for the Allies. The second attack was the previously surrounded unit. It attacked at 1-1, but the Allied player decided to drop the odds to 1-3. He must declare this before he spins the dice, because he basically wants to retreat, which is exactly what occurs. Moving to the other side, the Allied attacks at 1-1, spins 1, and the French retreats. They've been getting some good die rolls so far. Now we come to the centre, which is not so good for the Allies. The Allied cavalry attacks at 1-4, spins a 6, and is eliminated. The Allied cavalry element actually was already previously eliminated, so this shouldn't be occurring. But anyway, it was an error I made. And one of the issues with rules, if you create the simplest possible rules, you don't forget things. As soon as you start adding things which are slightly different or unusual, you begin to forget things. Unfortunately, in my playtest games, I'm the only one that really knows the rules extremely well. My opponents don't really know it. When you have a game where both people actually know the rules really well, these kind of errors are less likely. And that's with a simple set of rules, which is one reason why I'm gravitating towards simple sets of rules, because with complex sets of rules, there's a lot more things to forget. The Allies are forced into another poor odds attack. They spin a 4 at 1-2 and, as expected, are forced to retreat. Now the action in the north edge begins to hot up, and that's what we'll be looking at this particular point in time. In the next game turn, the Allies get a lot of reinforcements in this particular sector, so it's important that the initial forces, which are Prussian, manage to push as far forward as they possibly can. So, in the first attack here, we get a 1-1. Remember, the French unit is on a built-up area, which means it's doubled, so the Allies need 2 units in order to get a 1-1. They spin a 2, and the French retreat, which is a great victory for the Allies. Now, for the other 2 attacks, there's one at very low odds, which is a 1-in-4 attack. Now, this shows the position after the cavalry unit has actually withdrawn. You can see the cavalry unit on the top left corner. Anyway, the cavalry attacks at 1-4, which could actually result in elimination, but anyway, they spin a 4, so it's an AR. This is the one issue with trying to concentrate too much forces against one sector. It means that you have to make poor odd attacks elsewhere, which is an interesting game feature. The last attack is at 1-2, because it's 1 unit against 1 unit. The defenders on woods. Luckily, the Allies spin a 1, which means the French have to retreat. So this is a bit of an unexpected victory. So far in this particular sector, the Allied attack's doing very well indeed. The French initial position is effectively broken, which is not good for the French. In all cases, the Allies advance after combat with a unit, because they want to cause the French as many problems as possible. Now we start with game turn 3, and once again the French move and conduct combat. In the all-important French attack, the French player moves forward with every possible element they can muster to continue the attack. On the French left flank, they launch 3 attacks. There's no chance of an elimination here, so the order is not that important. All the attacks are at 2-1. In all cases, the result is DR. Now, I made this mistake once again. In 2 of the attacks, the results are actually DR-D1. So the Allies should have lost 2 elements, which would have mounted up their casualties. As I said, retrospectively, I went back and included all these casualties. One advantage of actually recording the game at this level of detail, I could actually do this. The French will make another attempt to surround and eliminate a unit. They launch a 2-1 attack and inflict DR. So far, it's going reasonably well. The French advance after combat, surrounding a Allied 4-element unit. The French now attack the surrounded unit and spin a 3. It's eliminated, another 4 elements down. Allied casualties are really mounting up at this point in time. The French make yet another attempt to eliminate another Allied unit, but it is another long shot. The key attack at 1 and 2 fails and the attacker retreats. I made another error here. The French should have lost 1 element. It's not super important because, again, French casualties don't affect the game so much in day 1. It's more of an effect in day 2 and 3, but nonetheless annoying. The second attack at 1 and 1 succeeds, forcing the Allied unit back, but of course it wasn't surrounded. At that all-important river crossing, the French counterattack, but both attacks fail and the French retreat. In the French rear, the French attempt to retake their defensive position. The two attacks result in a DR and the last in a AR. Once again, I forgot to take the French one element casualty, but again, not a major issue. So the French have partially retaken their defensive line, but unfortunately in the all-important sector, which is the town, they failed. This shows the final position at the end of the French combat phase. As you can see, the Allies have managed to crack the defensive line on the French left side of this particular position, which is not so good for the French. Now we do the Allied game turn, and during the Allied game turn an enormous amount of Russian reinforcements arrive basically just behind this particular frontline position, and this will put really major pressure on the French position. The Allies move forward with their reinforcements in order to attack the French position right across the entire line. Down south, the Allies attempt to shore up their position as best as they can. Most of the elements or units are in enemy zones of control, so they can't actually do very much, but they do what they can. This shows the Allied losses. The Allies have lost 12 elements. The Allied demoralisation level is 20, so if the French can eliminate another 8 elements, they've won. As the Allies should have lost 2 additional elements due to attrition, as well as the French losing 2 to 4 elements, there was in reality 6 elements more for the French to eliminate in order to win. So that's the margin at this particular point in time. It's the beginning of the Allied game turn 3, which is probably midpoint. The Allies need to only lose 6 more elements and they've lost the game. I'm not going to go into any details of the Allied attacks. The Allies attack, and this is the end point of their front line. As you can see, the centre has been broken by the French. Slightly more positive for the Allies actually are holding the towns across the river, managing to pin down 3 units, which is pretty good. If these 3 units were, or at least one additional unit was available to assist in the French attack, the Allied position would have even been more precarious than it is at the present moment. The Allies launch a number of attacks here, and this is the position in the north after those attacks. As you can see, the French front line or defensive line has been well and truly broken, and they've been forced back with some rather low odds attack during the French game turn. We now start a game turn 4. The French have 2 game turns to win. They only need to eliminate 6 elements and they've achieved their victory. During the French movement phase, the French bring up additional units and attempt to counterattack the most forward Allied unit in the northern part of the front line, as you can see here. Down in the main attack, the French continue their all-out attack. They've only got 6 more elements to eliminate and they've won, so there's no way they're going to halt their attack at this point in time. Now, along the road to France, I haven't really shown this very much because very little action occurs. The positions are, as you can see here, both sides have formed a front line of some description. Now, the Austrians will continue to withdraw here because, as you can see here, the Austrian left flank has a gap, but the French aren't going to really pursue very much here. So it's not really going to be that serious. This is probably roughly where it's going to remain until the end of the game. Now we come to the French attack. The French attack at 2 to 1, they spin a 2 and it's a DR. They force the Allies to withdraw. The French launch another 2 to 1 attack and achieve a DR. This unit causes a cascade DR across the line. Basically, if you're forced to retreat and there are friendly units in your way, you either move through them, which is okay, or if you're going to occupy the same spot, they've got to actually DR themselves. So it's basically a cascade effect. On the French left flank, the French attack at a 1 to 1 and a 2 to 1. The former fails and the later succeeds. The Allies' unit should have lost 1 element. Once again, I forgot, but I'm counting it now, which means the French only need to eliminate 6 or 5 more elements to win. The French launch another 2 to 1 and achieve another DR. Once again, I forgot the casualties, but I'm now retrospectively including the casualties. The French now need to only eliminate 4 more elements to win. In the river position, where the Allies have managed to get across the river, the French attack twice. One is a success, the other is a failure. They inflict 1 more casualty because they spun a 1, and now it's only 3 more elements to win. Up north, the French attack 3 times. The centre is a failure, but the other 2 attacks succeed and they force the Allies back. This shows the final position after the retreats. As you can see here, the defensive line is being re-established on the French right flank, but it's still broken down the bottom. Now we come to the Allied movement phase. The Allies attempt to basically adjust what they can down in the main French attack sector in order to survive. There's very little they can do because pretty much everything is in a zone of control. Up north, the Ally attack continues. It's an interesting point. Basically, the number of casualties for a French victory is so close. The Allies probably shouldn't bother attacking here, but the trouble is if they stop attacking, they risk the chance of the French redeploying units down south. So I suppose they have no choice. Again, one of the issues with the day 1 scenario, you're better off playing this entire scenario, that is the entire game, which is 3 days and consists of about 15 to 18 game turns. Takes about 6 hours to play and gives you a full game. The day 1 is more of a test game, which is what we're doing at this particular point in time. Okay, the Allies, because you have to attack when you're in a zone of control, they launch their 4 compulsory 1 and 2 attacks. 1 succeeds and 1 results in 1 more casualties. 2 more casualties to a French victory. The Allies on the other side of this desperate front line launch a equally desperate attack, which succeeds, forcing the French back. Unfortunately, they have to launch 1 low odds attack, which results in an AR. The Allies retreat, causing more difficulty for the poor old Allies. The final 2 attacks succeed, forcing the French back, which is a nice reprieve for the Allies. This shows the final position at the end of the Allied combat phase. You'll notice the Allies didn't actually advance after combat. Maybe they should have, but considering there's only 1 more game turn, there's probably not much point. Back up to the bridge where the Allies have managed to get across, the Austrians force the French yet again out of the town. This is a really vicious combat. Actually, I discovered historically this town was the scene of lots of backwards and forwards combats and counterattack, etc. I'm not quite sure if those attacks were occurring across the river or not, but nonetheless it was a hotspot of the actual battle, and it's certainly a hotspot in this particular game. Up north, the Allies' attack stalls and 1 more casualty results, which is not very good. 1 casualty is all that's required for a French victory. This shows the final position at the end of the Allied combat phase. There's only 1 more casualty in order to achieve a French victory. Now, it's an interesting point. The DR/D1 results that I include is not in the original rules. The reason why I include it is to provide some attrition. If they did not occur, then there would be no chance of an Allied defeat. So I'm wondering if possibly the inclusion may have upset the balance of the scenario. But nonetheless, I personally think that it's a fairly tight game at the present moment, so I think actually that modification is improving the situation rather than causing any difficulty. Anyway, that was my final conclusion. One example where a modification to the basic game system I think actually improved the game rather than caused problems. Now we come to the very last game turn, which is a game turn 5. The French now will move and conduct combat. The French move on game turn 5 and continue their assault down south. This is the position after the French movement phase. Up north, the French are not going to try and recapture their original defensive position. There's no chance of them doing that, and they decide to pull back behind the river. It's only 1 more game turn, so why not? The French launch 1 attack. They have no choice. It's at 1-1. The French have decided to reduce the odds to 1-3 because the French actually want to withdraw. This is successful. This is the final French defensive line in this particular sector. On day 2, even more reinforcements come and the French are in big trouble, but of course we don't get to day 2 in this particular game. It's only day 1. Now we go down to the river crossing. The French launch 2 attacks. 1 succeeds, and once again they manage to get some units into one of those 2 towns. This is the position after the advance after combat. As we can see, the town once again is reoccupied by the French. I'm sure that there's not much of the town left after this backwards and forward movements. In the main attack front, on the French left flank, the French launched 3 attacks. 1 results in 1 casualty. The Allies are now demoralised and withdrawn. Napoleon has won, and I'm now forced to speak French. I actually continued the game because we didn't actually know the game had ended at this point until the end, and a few more casualties actually resulted. So even if that didn't result in a casualty, the French would have won. Now, there are some unusual aspects associated with this scenario. The troop density is extraordinarily high. The French have 79 elements and receive 8 elements as reinforcements. The Allies have 55 elements on game turn 1 and receive 33 elements as reinforcements on day 1. This is a very dense battle with a total of 175 elements used during the game. In addition to this, the game length is extraordinarily short. At 5 game turns, this is probably the shortest game in the whole quadri-game series. On the other hand, this scenario, which I've played about 4 times, twice to completion, took about 2 to 3 hours to play, so this may be a good balance nonetheless. That is, if you're going to increase the number of elements, you better reduce the number of game turns, otherwise it takes too long to play. Now, one issue I had with the high density was the difficulty of fitting in the units. There is not much flexibility in manoeuvring, but then that may not be such a major issue. In the original board game, unit density is quite high in this particular area of the front line. The real issue I found was not so much the unit density, but the lack of depth to the Allied position. The board game had to fit the entire battle into a fixed space, and as both north and south player edges, the Allies really lack room. In one case, they can't withdraw adequately, in the other case, they can't outflank the French line. And both of these situations did not exist in reality. The issue exists in the original board game as well, so it's not unique to this figure game version. The other issue is because of the way they had to play around with scale, there's no artillery. The board game scale was scaled up so much, artillery could not be included. And artillery is actually a fairly important part of this particular game system. But anyway, it's one of the compromises of this particular battle. In my version 2 of the rules, I would double the size of the playing area and include artillery as well as alter the unit scale. But version 2 is not designed really to refight the exact SPI scenario, so it's a moot point. Instead, what I've done is I've created a Leipzig scenario with version 2 based on actual TOEs and used those unit forces and scaled accordingly. And Leipzig is a big battle. If you want to recreate it using version 2, you need to go to a scale of 4,000 to element, a stacking of 2, which means there's only 2 elements in each unit or 1 cavalry, and probably still you need to increase the size of the playing area. Nonetheless, even with all these issues, what surprised me is how close all 4 games were. If the French had failed to eliminate the last element, the Allies could have simply done nothing during their game turns and basically won the game. The other 3 games were not quite as close as this game, but were close regardless. In all, there were 2 French wins and 2 Allied wins. And once again, I find this rather unusual because in the original board game, it wasn't quite this close, and we had to play around with the victory conditions to get decent games in competitions. So I suspect my attrition rule in the CRT made it a little bit more even. Anyway, regardless, I'm not a great fan of having a victory condition based entirely on demoralisation unless you manage to extraordinarily kill a lot of units. And that didn't really occur in this particular game. So I suspect that I would want to play around with the victory conditions regardless, and also the demoralisation level. In the 5 test games, the first one where I had the playing area problem, which I don't normally count, I discovered a number of minor issues with the rules. Nothing major, but I had to clarify a number of points as often we came up with a can I do this moment, such as pinned against the river, is that surrounded or not? Now, the biggest change I made in the core rules was altering the stacking for cavalry and artillery. In the original rules, the stacking rate for these troop types was simply too great. Now, even with this, the unit depth issue was an issue. I probably feel the optimal stacking should be 3 infantry elements and 2 cavalry artillery elements in a single unit. But this is only an issue when you're fielding a massive force mix in a small playing area, so maybe changing this doesn't make that much sense. But nonetheless, I think this is optimal for the standard game. Nonetheless, these aspects, that is stacking and which is how big your units can be, is something players can play around with as they so desire, because it's actually a fairly simple thing to change if they wish. Now, the other issue is actually with the original scenario, nothing to do with the figure gaming rule. When you play the day one scenario, the French player can basically ignore his northern flank and throw everything against the Allies to the south, which is basically what the French did in this game. If you play the full game, this tactic is not wise, as if you fail to demoralise the Allied army by the end of day one, you will be in really major problems in day two. In fact, generally, the French player would normally want to surrender at this point. This is an issue with the way the scenario is constructed. Now, if I was designing the scenario from scratch, I would retain the demoralisation concept, but I would fix it as a percentage of the total army. And actually in the version 2 of my rules, that's what I do. Thus, it becomes harder for the French to achieve victory in this manner. Then I would use the holding and taking of objectives as the main method of winning the game. That is, if the French take a particular town, hold it, then they gain victory points, and that is what causes the French to launch their attacks rather than an attempt to, let's say, demoralise the Allied army. Now, one thing you would have noticed about this video and also the game system is how important luck is. Now, I've played this game system for many years, so I understand that luck is very important. To give you an example, in this game, the French launch about 30 attacks and the Allies about 25. That means basically you spin the dice between 50 and 60 times in a game. This is not many die rolls. Basically, this is not a complex game system. However, it does require a combination of skill as well as luck. Luck is important, but you do need to have the skill to launch your attacks in the correct way and get your figures in the correct position. So it's not entirely without skill, I can assure you. But in the end, when you really think about it, figure gaming is all about getting your figures out so you can move them around and have fun. Basically, I consider this game system as very successful. And from this point on, I'll be starting some play testing of points-based games to see how they work. I suspect they'll be better as the troop density will not be as high as what you saw in this particular video, and the game length will be longer, allowing for more movement and decisions to be made. But really the key point is that I really want games to end with 2 experienced players in about 2 hours. That is the real litmus test if the game system is simple enough to give you a fun game. And anyway, if you get a 2-hour game, once you include setup, pack up, etc., you can actually have 2 games in a day if you're at the club, allowing you to actually swap sides if you want to see who truly is the more experienced player. Now, just a quick note about the rules. Anyone can simply download the SPI Napoleon at War board game rules, maps and pieces and create their own figure gaming conversion. And I actually encourage people to do so. However, for those who wish to use the conversion that I've created, there are 2 versions available. Version 1 is a direct copy of the rules and all the scenarios. The rules do have a number of issues with them, and I'll have to go back and fix that. But all the issues were caused by my attempts to modify the basic rules. They're nothing to do with the actual basic conversion. They're really all my fault because I wanted to add stuff to give me a better figure gaming feel. And that's not really the objective of these rules. Now, I only discovered these problems after I conducted quite a few playtest games. Now, saying this, version 1 does have all the SPI scenarios converted, and players can certainly use these scenarios to create your playing areas and to refight the battles that are contained. And you can do your own modifications to the rules to overcome the problems that you may find or not find. Now, version 2, on the other hand, is a complete and total rewrite and has corrected all the issues with version 1. However, it's not really designed to be used with the SPI scenarios because the scales are fixed. The SPI games all use different scales to allow you to have a 20,000 man battle fit in the same playing area as a 200,000 man battle. Saying that, there are optional rules with version 2 which allow you to refight the original SPI battles if you wish to use the force mixes for those particular scenarios. I personally would simply use proper TONEs and do the conversion yourself, and you can create your own scenario. And I've actually done some basic ones in version 2. Regardless, version 2 really is designed to be a points-based set of rules rather than recreating a very specific scenario. In summary, basically download the scenarios from the version 1 because the scenarios are useful if you want to refight those particular scenarios. And I would download the rules from the version 2 folder, or, as I indicated at the beginning here, do your own conversion and play these games. And so we come to a close of my part 2 of my Napoleon at War example game video. One aspect which I did find interesting in these examples, game videos, which I wanted to quickly cover here. With more complex figure gaming rules, I find it hard to get enough photos to show a game flow, and I lose interest after a few game turns of doing this. Using this game system, it's not an issue. Games are short, results are clear. I have time during the opponent's game turn to take pictures, and I'm not left exhausted. I like complex rules, but I realise why the hobby fails to gain many new players if you focus on complex rules, and that is the typical figure gaming rules simply cause too much exhaustion, too difficult to learn, and they lack sufficient fun, and you rarely get to an end. This particular game system achieves this. Now, there are other figure gaming rules which achieve this as well. You know, DBN is a classic example, and the whole range of area movement games that come out. And I think that's the reason why people are moving towards the simpler rather than the more complex. But nonetheless, this I think is a good way of having a good, fun, simple and historically accurate Napoleonics figure gaming game. Denken Sie daran, immer für Hilfe zu kämpfen.